significant part of the narrative, dialogue rather than action, of Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Averroes Search, is going to be a dinner party at the house of Faraj, who is a Quranist. He's a student of the Quran, an expositor of it. And they're going to be dining with this traveler, Abu Al Hasan, who has reputedly traveled all the way to China. So he's got some traveler's tales to narrate, but we're going to see a lot of philosophical and religious discussion happening before that. And I do want to mention a great line that Borges has in here. So some people say that, Hassan never set foot in China, and at the same time that he blasphemed Allah and the temples of that land. And he calls this a peculiar logic born of hatred, something, people can put contradictory charges together. And so Averroes works on his particular project until dusk, and then goes to Faraj's house. And we see the conversation move from the incomparable virtues of the governor to those of his brothers, the emir. Then out in the garden, the talk was of roses. And now we're going to get some marvels being brought up. So the first topic is a challenge that is being brought up to Al Hasan. So Abu Al Hasan, having never seen them, said there were no roses like those which bedeck the villas of Andalusia. Faraj was not to be suborned by flattery. He observed that the learned Ibn Katabiah had described a superb variety of perpetual rose, which grows in the gardens of Hindustan and whose petals of a deep crimson red exhibit characters reading, "There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet," the creed or shahada that is so important within Islam, the first pillar of Islam. And he says, you must be acquainted with those roses. And this raises a dilemma for Abu Al Hasan. If he says yes, he would be judged to be the most pliable and serviceable of impostors. If he said no, he would be judged an infidel. And so what he says, he takes a new way out of the dilemma and says that Allah holds the keys that unlock hidden things, and there's no green or wilted thing on earth that is not recorded in his book. And then he was about to declare that Allah is perfect in his works and inscrutable, but Averroes is going to bring up a interesting criticism that prefigures that of Hume. Now, Borges is referring to David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher. What does he have in mind? Hume's discussion of miracles, which can be found in the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which depends on examining testimony. So what does Averroes contribute to the conversation? It is an issue of credibility. He says, I find it less difficult to accept an error in the learned Ibn Kutabiya or in the copyist than to accept that the earth brings forth roses with the profession of our faith. Now, why? Why would he be saying, Allah can do whatever he wants? Well, we live in a world that does have greater and lesser probabilities. And Al Hasan agrees with him because this gets him off the hook. And then the poet Abd al-Malik says, some traveler, I recall, speaks of a tree whose branches put forth green birds. I am pained less by believing in that tree than in roses adorned with letters. And so the poet is supporting Averroes' sort of hierarchy of what is likely and what we ought to believe in. Averroes says, well, the bird's color does seem to make that wonder easier to bear. In addition, both bird and the fruits of trees belong to the natural world, while writing is an art. So there's a big distinction here between how the natural world works and how artifacts and things of human skill work. And so he says to move from leaves to birds is easier than to move from roses to letters. Now, I want to pause on that for a moment, because one of the other themes that's going to come up is metaphors. And the way that metaphors work, particularly described by Aristotle, who Averroes is writing a commentary on, is by using terms that take us from one thing to another. They liken things to each other, and the likening can be closer or further away. So leaves to birds, roses to letters, one of them is a greater jump, a transformation. And now we get into a discussion about writing and the Quran, the holy book, right? Another guest denied that writing was an art because the original book of the Quran, the mother of the book, predates the creation and resides in heaven. Now, this is a common Islamic doctrine, not held by everybody, but certainly part of Islamic philosophy and theology, that there is an eternal Quran. Another spoke of Al-Jahiz of Basra, who had stated the Quran is a substance that can take the form of man or animal, an opinion which appears to agree with that of people who attribute to the Quran two faces. That's a little bit more difficult to buy into, right? Faraj discoursed on Orthodox doctrine, calling the Quran one of the attributes of Allah. Even as His mercy is, it may be copied in a book, pronounced with the tongue or remembered in the heart, but while language and signs and writing are the work of men, the Quran itself is irrevocable and eternal. Averroes, we read, who had written his commentary on Plato's Republic, might have said the mother of the book is similar in a way to the Platonic idea, but he could see that the theology was one subject utterly beyond the grasp of Abu Al Hasan. So that brings the first discussion to an end, a rather inconclusive one, but it's setting the stage. The second topic, this one is much more germane to the overall story. Abu Al Hasan is asked, tell us some traveler's tales. And so the one that he focuses on in particular will be the not clue that would help Averroes figure out what these words comedy and tragedy refer to. But he doesn't get it. So he talks about, once we get a little bit past some, jockeying for, knowledge about foreign places, he talks about going to a place. One evening, the Muslim merchants of Sin-e-Kalal conducted me to a house of painted wood in which many persons lived. It is not possible for me to describe that house, which was more like a single room with rows of cabinet-like contrivances or balconies, one on top of another. In these niches, there were people eating and drinking. There were people sitting on the floor as well, and also on a raised terrace. So a lot of people in this exhibition, we could say. What happens next? The people on the terrace were playing the tambour and the lute. All that is, save for 15 or 20 who wore crimson masks and prayed and sang and conversed among themselves. So we've got two kinds of people doing things there, right? And he says, these masked ones suffered imprisonment, but no one could see the jail. They rode upon horses, but the horse was not to be seen. They waged battle, but the swords were of bamboo. They died, and then they walked again. And we see Faraj saying, the acts of madmen are beyond that which a sane man can envision. And he says, well, they weren't mad. They were, as a merchant told me, presenting a story. We reading this can say, aha, there were musicians and there were actors, and this was a theater, and this Muslim wanderer, wayfarer, traveler, merchant was just not able to recognize this as drama, right? Because that's not something particularly important in Islamic culture at that time, with a few exceptions that we can talk about, but certainly not in Spain, Andalusia, and not throughout most of the Islamic world until much later on, with the exception, of course, we could say, of the Shiites. But these are Sunni, so it makes sense. So then they begin talking about stories. And Hasan says, let us imagine someone shows a story instead of telling it. The story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, say, we see them retire into the cavern, we see them pray and sleep, we see them sleep with their eyes open, we see them grow while they're asleep, we see them awaken after 309 years, we see them hand the merchant an ancient coin, we see them awaken in paradise, we see them awaken with the dog. It was something like that the persons on the terrace showed us that evening. And Faraj says, did they speak? He says, yes, of course. They spoke and sang and gave long, boring speeches. And then Faraj says, well, in that case, there was no need for 20 persons. A single speaker could tell anything, no matter how complex it was. And so they come to a consensus, yeah, this is kind of a waste of time. Those strange foreigners with their odd ways that seem to be unnecessary. And now we come to the third topic. Arabic as a language, and poetry, which is very important in Arabic, particularly at that time. They extolled the virtues of Arabic, the language used by Allah when He instructs the angels, and then the poetry of the Arabs. And then we get an interesting contention. Abu Al Hasan dismissed those other poets who, writing in Cordoba or Damascus, okay, so these are massive cities, right, where people have been living for generations. What's wrong with that? They cling to pastoral images and Bedouin vocabulary. So the early Arabs are living out in the desert, and they've now become cityfied, so to speak. Why are they still sticking with this old vocabulary? He says that it's outmoded. It's absurd for a man whose eyes beheld the wide Guadalquivir to compose odes on the water of a well. It was time, he argued. Now notice what he says. It's time for the old metaphors to be renewed. Not gotten rid of, but to be renewed. Back when Zuyahir compared fate to a blind camel, he said the figure was arresting, but 500 years of admiration had worn it very thin. And this is not the first time this is being said. As we learn, this verdict, which they'd all heard many times before from many mouths, they likewise gave their nod. But Averroes kept silent, and then he spoke not so much to the others as to himself. And he's going to make a sort of philosophical argument here. He says, I have defended sometimes that proposition. In Alexandria, there's a saying that only the man who's already committed a crime and repented of it is incapable of that crime. To be free of an erroneous opinion, one must at one time have professed it. So he's saying, I bought into that point of view, but now I think it's actually wrong, and I am in a better place to tell you why it's wrong. So why is it wrong? He says, Zuyahir says that in the course of his 80 years of pain and glory, many is the time he's seen destiny trample man like an old blind camel. Abu Al Hasan says that figure no longer makes us marvel. But we might reply to this objection in many ways. First, if the purpose of the poem were to astound, its life would not be measured in centuries, but in days or hours or perhaps even minutes. So the purpose of a poem is to do something other than just to make us marvel. What is it? Well, we'll come to that. Second, a famous poet is less an inventor than a discoverer. In praise of Ibn Sharif of Berka, it's been said many times that not only was he capable of imagining the stars of the morning fell gently like leaves falling from the trees, a beautiful metaphor. If that were true, it would only prove the image is trivial. The image that only a single man can shape is an image that interests no man. So when we create images, they're not just for ourselves, they're for others, or else they don't have any effect. He goes on and says, there's infinite things upon the earth. Any one of them can be compared to any other. Comparing stars to leaves is no less arbitrary than comparing them to fish or birds. On the other hand, every man has surely felt at some moment in his life that destiny is powerful, yet clumsy, innocent, yet inhuman. It was in order to record that feeling, which may be fleeting or constant, but which no man may escape experiencing, that Zoyar's line was written. No one will ever say better what Zoyar said there. So metaphors have to be recovered. We have to trace them to the sorts of things that they evoke if they're going to hold their strength. And then he's going to say, time enriches poetry. Time wears everything else out, but poetry, in a certain respect, it makes greater. Why? Well, the figure originally had two terms. Now it has four. There was the old camel and that of destiny, repeated today. It also serves to recall Zuhair and to conflate our own tribulations with those of the dead Arab. So there's a richness to it. If we do the work required to understand the metaphor. And so he goes on and says, time widens the circle of the verses, and I myself know some verses that are like music, all things to all men. Then Averroes is going to close this by doing something that's kind of a rhetorical trick. He speaks of the first poets who'd already said all things in the infinite language of the deserts, alarmed by the insane versifications of Ibn Sharif. He said that in the ancients and the Quran could all poetry be read, and he condemned as illiterate and vain all desire to innovate. The others listened with pleasure, for he was vindicating that which is old. And then the muezzins were calling the faithful of prayer to the prayer of first light when Averroes enters his library again. So he's left the dinner party and he's going to retake up his studies. So these are the conversations that are taking place there. You could say they're speculative, right? These are all ideas about things that none of them have actually witnessed, except for perhaps Abu Al Hasan. There's no reason why we should think that he didn't see this drama going on, which he recounts. But so many of the other things being brought up in here are, well, so-and-so has said that, and that's all testimony. So this question of who should we trust that comes up with the roses at the beginning is a very important one. And these are all connected together in this record of essentially an imaginary conversation that Borges is putting before us.